relationships that he develops is with the warden. He becomes friends with the warden. The warden has a kind of a special pet project. He's getting ready to celebrate an anniversary with his wife, and his wife loves the Taj Mahal. And he can't figure out how to put it all together and take the supports out, so he gets Michael Scofield, who's a structural engineer, to come and help him. And all the while, Scofield is plotting his escape with his brother. Eventually, he physically assaults the warden. He makes him do things that, as far as freeing him and his brother, that he would have never had to do had that relationship not been there. Now, we're 3 or 4 seasons into this TV series, and one thing we picked up on that it flashes back to is all those relationships and those people that were hurt by Michael Scofield in order for him to free his brother. The constant question, does the ends justify the means? Can I hurt innocent people in order to save my brother? And he has a very difficult time allowing those two things to weigh on his conscience. These Jewish leaders had no problem whatsoever saying that religiously they could keep themselves clean by not doing certain things, like entering into Pilate's house. But on the flip side of things, they were perfectly comfortable with the request for Jesus to be killed. What you have to understand was the Passover celebration that they were celebrating was one of those cosmic experiences in history when God reached down to a group of people and developed a relationship with them. And these Jewish leaders had boiled that relationship God had given them down to a certain list of rules. Let me put it in terms that we might understand a little bit better. It's the idea that I can talk down to my kids, but that's okay because I'm going to go to church. Or I can ignore my wife and treat her in whatever manner I want to, but that's all right because I'm in a weekly Bible study. It's okay to create division or to gossip as long as I'm tithing. You see, if you can do one and the other simultaneously and your conscience isn't heavy, I guess the question would become, have you perfected religion and lost a relationship? Even as I'm saying this, I have in my own mind people I have not forgiven justifiably, as we can stand up and allow our religion to overtake a relationship that constantly changes us. Are you in Jesus' kingdom? Pilate enters in verse 33 back away from the Jews into the room with Jesus, probably by himself, maybe with a few soldiers. And the Jewish leaders were outside, maybe dressed up in hazmat suits for fear of being contaminated by a Gentile. Pilate comes back in and begins to try and understand, what do these people hate so much about Jesus? And so he starts asking, are you king of the Jews? And Jesus turns this back on him and says, is this question from you or from somebody else? Pilate then responds to Jesus kind of dismissively, you know I'm not a Jew, as if to say, I don't really care about your customs, I just want to know what the problem is. Pilate didn't want to be in this situation. And Jesus turns the conversation to the direction that he wanted to go, like we see him do time and time again. He turns the conversation to talk through what he wanted to talk through. He says, this world is not my kingdom, because if it was, my servants would be fighting. If this world was my kingdom, my servants would be fighting. There was only 2 ways a person could come to power as a king. And the first way was if they were a son or a nephew of a king and that king passed on. The second way you could become a king was if you did a military conquest and took over, like Herod the Great had 30 years before Jesus was born. So either by being an heir to the throne or by violence. And so Jesus says to him, this world is not the world of my kingdom, or my servants would have been fighting. And Pilate responds to him, so you're saying you are a king? And Jesus responds again, you say this correctly, I am a king, giving Pilate the necessary proof he needed to crucify him. There's a story in the Old Testament about a battle between the Gileads and the Ephraimites. And the Gileads in this fight won, but the Ephraimites scattered. And so there was this story's in Judges, and the Gileads decided they needed to capture and kill all the Ephraimites, and they weren't sure how to do it. And finally they realized, you know what, we'll take all the river crossings over, and when an Ephraimite comes up, we'll do a test for them. So the test went something like this, because the Ephraimites and the Gileads, they all looked the same. They couldn't tell just by looking at them. So when an Ephraimite would come up, they would say, are you from Ephraim? And if they said no, they would say, well, then say this word. This was their test. They would say Shibboleth. And if the person could say the word Shibboleth, they would let them go. The problem was an Ephraimite, someone from Ephraim, could not say an SH. And so when they would say to them, say Shibboleth, an Ephraimite would say Sibboleth. They couldn't pronounce that SH. They could dress up in whatever manner they wanted to look like someone from Gilead. The problem was they couldn't act differently than the way they had been raised. This kingdom that Jesus is talking to Pilate about here is a kingdom not based on looks, but based on acts. Jesus said it like this in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. James states it like this. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is to visit orphans and widows and keep oneself unspotted from the world. What Jesus is telling Pilate here then and us now is it's not based on looks. It's based on how you act. And in the midst of this trial of impending death, Jesus looks Pilate in the eyes and says, I speak God's truth of love. And in his admission of being a king, he decides to take on the price of man's sin through a perfect death. Jesus is truth. The last line in verse 37 is when Jesus said, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Jesus is saying there is an absolute truth. There is a big T truth, and that is God's kingdom.